Namaste. A secret history of Tablighi Jamaat. Usually when we hear this term secret history, the connotation often is of a narrative that is either suppressed, lost, forgotten, or somehow not accessible. However, I use this term secret history in context of Tablighi Jamaat with a slightly different meaning. Secret, not because it is suppressed or lost. Actually, history of Tablighi Jamaat is pretty much available in plain sight, very easily accessible. However, perhaps going by the narratives that have appeared about Tablighi Jamaat in the recent times, due to the attention it has drawn to itself, we could see that the narrative of Tablighi Jamaat is not properly situated and located in the larger project of Islam. So that is what we shall try to do in this conversation. But let us start from an interesting true story which happened several decades back during the British India time. In the Multan city of Punjab, there used to be a wealthy, influential zamindar whose two sons were studying in a college of Lahore. The sons disappeared without any trace, and for several months neither him nor the police could find where they were. Then one day suddenly a mullah comes to zamindar carrying news and messages from the boys. His boys had skipped college, the mullah told zamindar, to join an Islamic army in Afghanistan named Junood-ul-Rabbaniya, led by a couple of Maulanas from whom the boys were learning more about Islam. So the zamindar catches hold of the mullah, beats him up. He and his men interrogate him to extract more information, and they learn that the mullah has quite a lot of information up his sleeves, literally. I say literally because when they take out the jacket of mullah, they discover that underneath the sleeves and the lining of the coat, mullah had hidden several messages, secret messages. So once those messages, those letters are extracted from the coat, they find that those are written on yellow silk cloth in black ink and in a very cryptic Persian, which of course the zamindar and his men could make no head or tail of. So they hand over this mullah and the letters to the Punjab police. Punjab police makes inquiries and interrogates mullah, and then in a sequence of events which would seem to be coming straight from plot of some Sherlock Holmes novel of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a much bigger discovery of plot of a conspiracy is made. So I said Sherlock Holmes, and it would be interesting to mention that the last of Sherlock Holmes novels actually came out just a couple of months before the events of which we speak, the Valley of Fear. So the police makes the investigation, and they find that these letters are addressed to a very influential person of India of that time, the most influential Maulana of that time, named Mahmud ul Hasan. Mahmud ul Hasan was the head of Darul Uloom Deoband, the Madrasa of Deoband. He was called Sheikh ul Hind, the Sheikh of Hind, by his admirers. And during this time he was actually living in Makkah. The letters were written, one of the letters was written by another senior Maulana of Deoband Madrasa named Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi. Another letter was written by the grandson of the founder of Deoband Madrasa, and in these two letters there are details given of the entire strategy of how they wanted to wage a jihad on India to re-establish an Islamic state, and for doing that how they were mobilizing support from across the world, especially from Afghanistan, Turkey and Arabia. So of course larger part of Arabia was then in turmoil. The First World War had just started, and as of then the Ottoman Turkish Empire was neutral, and yet between British and Ottomans there were a lot of tensions. In Mecca, the Sharif of Mecca was a kind of supporter of British, so they lean on him to get arrest of this Maulana Hassan Maid. He is arrested. Not only that, there are more than 225 very senior Maulanas all over India who are named in those letters as the supporters and perhaps participants in some shape or form in that conspiracy of jihad. They are arrested all over India as well. Thus this story unfolded and kind of got nipped in the bud as well. So few interesting parts in this story which we should highlight. First is, if you think that the occurrence that we often hear about of some young Muslims from Kerala running away, going to Afghanistan or Syria to fight for ISIS, and think that this is something unique which is happening in India for the first time, that would be far from truth. In this story that I just narrated of Mahmud Hassan's jihad and how men from different parts of India, especially Punjab and Ganga Yamuna plains, go and stay in Afghanistan to wage jihad, is a glaring example of the same. In fact, many of these young Muslims who returned and were arrested by the British, they wrote the biographical accounts of what all went on. One such was published in 1965 by a Pakistani person in Urdu. The book is called Aap Beeti. It gives detailed narration of how very young people used to be recruited from madrasas and colleges. They used to be trained in armed warfare, sent to Afghanistan to fight. Another interesting thing that we learned from this story is that a lot of times these people used to be new converts to Islam. So just like Muhammad Ali Jinnah or the poet Iqbal, who were only second generation converts and who became kind of ideological and political generals in the project of creating Pakistan. And also, just like we hear that some of these Kerala Muslims who went to Syria and Afghanistan to join ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc., were actually neo-converts. In this story itself, in fact, this mullah that I mentioned, Ubaidullah Sindhi, he was a Sikh and he converts to Islam, and not only converts to Islam, becomes a mullah who studies in Deoband Madrasa and eventually becomes jihadi. Not only him, very few people know about this, but third of those 3 silk letters was written to another mullah in Hyderabad of Sindh. Was actually a brother, real brother of famous Congress leader Acharya J.B. Kriplani. Can you imagine that? The brother of Acharya J.B. Kriplani was he had converted to Islam, and not only converted to Islam, he became the supply chain runner for the creation of Islamic State back then, in this jihad of which I speak. As a matter of fact, another of Kriplani's brothers was a jihadi as well, converted to Islam, and he went so far as Turkey to fight in jihad. Both of these brothers of Kriplani died in combat. So that's an interesting thing not many people know about. But I think I digressed far away from the main point of the story. Why did we even start with this story? Because going by all the articles that newspapers have written, Tablighi Jamaat didn't even exist back then. It came into picture in 1925 or 26, they say. So I started with this story for a couple of reasons. First of all, this event was the beginning of the end of the last time the Muslims of India directly confronted the British Empire, with a couple of exceptions. Sure, in Azad Hind Fauj they did combat. Even in the same First World War also, there were some revolts in Singapore, Malaysia, etc., Europe as well. But by and large, a full-fledged jihad against British was not called for after this. So the birth of Tablighi Jamaat and the circumstances which gave birth to Tablighi Jamaat are to do with the failure, complete utter failure of this jihad. So that's first reason. We'll come back to the circumstances that led to this. And second, the founder of Tablighi Jamaat, Maulana Muhammad Ilyas Kandhalwi, the great-grandfather of the current Amir, who Indian police is looking for, Maulana Saad Kandhalwi. So this founder of Tablighi Jamaat was a direct disciple of the Sheikh-ul Hind Mahmud ul Hasan of Deoband. This fact is often overlooked. I won't say hidden or suppressed, but bypassed and overlooked in most of the biographies of Muhammad Ilyas Kandhalwi. So, for example, if you read a book on Tabligh movement by famous scholar Maulana Wahiduddin Khan, he does not even once mentions the name of Maulana Hasan. He completely skips him. But if you go through older biographies, especially Urdu biographies, especially the one written by the famous scholar Ali Mian of Nadwatul Madrasa in Lucknow, if you read his account of Maulana Muhammad Ilyas, he clearly mentions that the basic education of Maulana Ilyas in the early days was done at the feet of Maulana ul Hasan. He was his second teacher. In fact, his can I use the word Guru Bhai? But after the death of that co-founder of Deoband, he continued to study. Especially he studied Tirmizi and Hadith, other Hadith books from Maulana Mahmudul Hasan. Not only that, Ali Mia's biography of Muhammad Ilyas Kandhalwi clearly says that founder of Tablighi Jamaat, Muhammad Ilyas, took the vow of jihad in front of this Maulana ul Hasan. at another place in this book, Ali Mia mentions that he was pretty young. He was a teenager, maybe 13 or 14-year-old, and he would go to his friend with a stick in hand, and he would say, "Hey, get up, let's go and wage a jihad, let's fight a jihad." So this roots of the founder of Tablighi Jamaat to be connected with jihad and actual armed jihad, not the so-called greater jihad or spiritual jihad, but jihad which he could fight with a stick, is pretty much there in the roots of Tablighi Jamaat. But not only that, at this very time in 1915-16, when these events unfolded, when Maulana Mahmud al-Hasan was in Makkah, Muhammad Ilyas Kandhalwi, he was himself present in Makkah. His first Hajj, he did multiple Hajjas later, but his very first Hajj was at that time, when, and to accompany that very time his master Mahmud al-Hasan. So that's another reason I started with that story, that the result of all of this was for Muhammad Ilyas to find a new way of doing something about this jihad, of creation of Islamic supremacy and revival of Islam in India. There are several other points that are, I think, important enough for us to understand, and especially because those are overlooked. I think I should add one more aspect of this whole story. If you read the history of movements like 1857 or Ghadar movement of the times that we speak, or even later personalities like Abul Kalam Azad and other so-called nationalist Muslim freedom fighters, the impression is given by the narrative often is that they were nationalist, patriotic Indians who happened to be Muslims, and usually they are kind of given space out of proportion simply to peddle this story of nationalist, Indian nationalist Muslims. But if you scratch the surface very little, you discover the reality was quite different. The motive behind any of this spectrum of Muslims, with few exceptions, I acknowledge them too, but with very few exceptions, the rest of the spectrum of these people who fought British, their motive was to establish Islam as a power, and for them Ummah and Khilafat, that is the global Islamic state, was the primary motive to fight the war locally in India as well. So it's unfortunate that even the literature created by staunch Hindus, even Hindutva leaders such as Savarkar, at some places they fail to recognize this fact. So for example, in this book written by Savarkar, 1857, where he is the first one, this was written in early parts of 1900s when he was hardly 25-26 years old, and this book kind of is praised by especially the secularists and so on as the great work of history. Savarkar did not yet, I mean, he was a young person and not fully exposed to everything. In this book, often he does recognize this Islamist, pan-Islamist tendency. He in fact mentions Wahhabis by name, and he seems to be aware a little bit about what's going on, and yet he would kind of give them cover as Indian patriots, etc., not even once inquiring what was the motive, what were they fighting for. Last week, the chairman of Delhi Minorities Commission, Dr. Zafrul Islam Khan, put out a message in the social media. The message was largely addressed to the global Muslim fraternity, the Ummah, but especially to the Arab Muslims. He had three main points in the message. First was, he reminded the Ummah how much sacrifices Indian Muslims have done for the Muslim fraternity. Second, he mentioned a few Indian Muslim scholars who had gone on to become, I think what he said, household names in the Muslim world globally. And thirdly, he reminded the Hindus, or he said Hindutva bigots or something like that, that so far Indian Muslims have not complained to the Ummah or the Arabs, and should they do so, the Hindus or India should be prepared to face the avalanche of reactions. So Dr. Khan is absolutely right on the first point. Indian Muslims throughout the centuries have significantly contributed to the global Muslim fraternity, the Ummah. So the chronicles in Farsi and Arabic, right from 13th century onwards, abundantly inform us how much flow of funds from India used to be sent to Arabia and rest of the Muslim world from India by the sultans and other Muslim kings. Of course, that money was not sent by the Indian Muslims out of their own earnings. Largely the revenue collected from a vastly Hindu population. The chronicles also tell us how richly the preferences used to be given to the employments to the Muslims from Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Central Asia and elsewhere, in preference over the rest of the Indians. And chronicles also mention, for example, Ain-e-Akbari mentions how the ships loaded with gifts sent by Akbar, when they used to reach Mecca or the ports in Arabia, there used to be almost like street riots. Very recently, even less than within the last 1 century, we can notice how during the Khilafat agitation, it was largely Indian Muslims who were concerned about preservation and protection of Khilafat or the Islamic State. And it was largely Indian Muslims who, for example, funded the construction of the railway in Hijaz, which is the biggest province of Arabia, just about less than 100 years back. In fact, one of the Indian Muslims used to be the moving force behind global collection of funds from the Indian Muslim donations for that project. And in fact, throughout the recent history, last 100 or 200 years, there is ample evidence to show how Indian Muslims have been concerned for the Ummah. In recent times, we have seen how Indian Muslims have been moved to streets for Rohingyas or Chinese Muslims or other such issues. They seem to be concerned often more about Ummah than the local issues within India, perhaps. So he's right. But more importantly, he mentions a few names in his message, which I thought was directly related to our topic, our conversation. So he mentioned Shah Waliullah Dehlvi. He mentioned Iqbal, Wahiduddin Khan, Zakir Naik and Ali Mia. So we have already seen, we have already mentioned in this talk before how Ali Mia and Wahiduddin Khan, both great scholars, had been carrier tabligis of several decades. They have been Deobandi missionaries, and in fact not many people might know, so might be important to inform that Dr. Zafrul Islam Khan himself is son of Maulana Wahiduddin Khan. I do not know whether he himself has been a Tablighi or not, but his father Wahiduddin Khan has been connected with Tabligh movement for several decades. In fact, one of the most popular books about Tabligh has been authored by Wahiduddin Khan, and so is Maulana Abul Qasim or Ali Mia, who also, as I mentioned earlier, has written a book on Tabligh movement, and especially a very well acknowledged biography on the founder of Tabligh, Maulana Ilyas Kandhelwi. But the most important name of all these is that of course, Shah Waliullah, and perhaps it should be important for us to pause for a moment and understand the work of Shah Waliullah, because his ideology and his thought process is the groundwork on which Deoband movement and Tablighi Jamaat movement actually stand. So Shah Waliullah happened at the beginning of 18th century. He was born in 1703 or 1702, right at the beginning of the crumbling of Mughal empire. So Aurangzeb was still alive, but very soon after Aurangzeb's death, the sliding of power of Mughals would start, and that's when Shah Waliullah happened. So Shah Waliullah was a Mujaddid. In Islamic tradition and terminology, Mujaddid is, you can say, a reformer who happens once in 100 years. So it's the role of Mujaddid to realign the practices of Islam, reform the practices of Islam, to make them true to the spirit of Islam as preached by the Prophet and practiced by his initial followers. Now, by this word reform, let's make no mistake, in context of Islam, reform really just means kind of rebooting little bit, rejecting any innovations in the religious, spiritual practices that might have creeped in, rearranging Islamic interests considering the socio-political, economical situations that might be prevailing at that time, and overall bringing Islam back to the progress, path of progress. That's the meaning of reform, really. Not foundationally or fundamentally altering Islam itself. So that's not reform in context of Islam. You might say more of a revival than reform. So Shah Waliullah was that Mujaddid who did that for Islam in India. Now, Tablighi Jamaat is very closely related with Shah Waliullah. In fact, several of the madrasas and mosques that Tabligh controls are named after Shah Waliullah. And in the Tablighi literature, Shah Waliullah is much respected, Maulana. So it's important for us to understand, as I said, Shah Waliullah's work. And best way to do that is a couple of books written by Professor Sayyid Attar Abbas Rijvi. The first is Muslim Revivalist Movements in Northern India, in which he throws light about the ideological groundwork before Shah Waliullah happened, his predecessors. And the second book is Shah Waliullah and His Times, where he goes in depth, in detail, analyzing Shah Waliullah's work. So as I said, Shah Waliullah happened at a time when Islamic power in India was going through a great slide downwards. Already Mughals were crumbling. Islamic state in a way in India had been divided into multiple powers. There were regional Muslim sultans that were just emerging. Some of them were actually Shia. So the prime minister of the later Mughals of that time, he was a Shia himself. Lucknow, Awadh became a center of Shias. And there were several other Shia nobles in power as well, which was very concerning to Shah Waliullah on one hand. And on the other, Marathas were continuously on the rise. So by the time Waliullah was a teenager, he had already seen Islamic power politically shrinking very quickly. And in religious sphere also, the Sunni power perhaps was challenged on one hand by Shias, on the other lot of Sufi kind of influences were creeping in. So Shah Waliullah, he wrote several letters, pamphlets. He was very active. He used to communicate with the Muslim kings, not only with the Mughal empire, namesake Mughal empire emperor, but also several other Muslim kings such as Nizamul Mulk in Hyderabad. He used to write letters to several nobles, influential and rich people all over India, not only in India, worldwide. And in fact, it's interesting to know that his most of the work is not in Urdu as later Deobandis would do, but actually in Arabic and Persian, considering that his reach was global and he was communicating with the Ummah. Also, just like Dr. Zafrul Islam Khan mentioned, reaching out to the global Ummah for the interest of Indian Muslims, he in fact did actively communicate not only with the Khalifa, but also it was Shah Waliullah who practically invited the fourth invasion of Ahmad Shah Durrani or Abdali from Afghanistan. So the letters and pamphlets written by Waliullah are recorded, and you can see how fundamentalist the ideology that later would occupy the Deobandi space was. So he openly called all the Muslim kings to invade non-Muslims, suppress violently if required, but definitely through the machine of the state. Open celebration of Hindu festivals like Holi. In his letters he says, in all the towns in which Muslims have control, let there be no such display of Hindu festivals, let there be no bathing in Ganga, etc. Also for Shias, he says that in the Muharram, let them not do the processions and especially tabarra or kind of ritual criticism of the first three Khalifas before Hazrat Ali, etc. So he says all of that. But there is a very important fact which most people, most historians have missed out, including Professor Rizvi. So in this great work on Waliullah, even Professor Rizvi does not notice the correspondence he has, correspondence, not literary correspondence, not written correspondence, but actual physical correspondence he has with Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab of Arabia. So as most of you would have heard this name, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the forefather of this so-called Wahhabi Islam that took roots at the same time in Arabia. The correspondence between Wahhab and Waliullah is generally missed out. So let's mention that here. Both Waliullah and Abdul Wahab were exact contemporaries. Not only were they exact contemporaries, they were both born in the same year. As a matter of fact, they might have even met in Arabia. So if we study the biographies of both side by side, we realize that both were in the same city of Medina in the same year, in their early 20s, studying under the same teacher, Sheikh Muhammad Hayat al-Sindhi. So it's very interesting, which fact many people have not paid attention to. And if you notice, both Abdul Wahab in Arabia and Waliullah in India, they both studied, as I said, under this Sheikh Muhammad Hayat. And Sheikh Muhammad Hayat himself, interestingly, had the two different streams of fiqh or jurisprudence of Islam merging into him. So Wahhabis are Hanbalis and Deobandis, or Shah Waliullah's ideology, they are Hanafis. And this Maulana, who both Abdul Wahab and Waliullah studied from, he was both Hanafi and Hanbali. He was Hanafi, but significantly influenced by Hanbali ideology. So we see the coming together of this Indian Islam, Deobandi Islam, which became later, and Wahhabi ideology in Saudi Arabia. It was not Saudi back then, of course, coming together, which again you would see coming together in Afghanistan 2 centuries later, in our own times, when Al-Qaeda, which follows Wahhabi Salafi ideology, and Mullah Omar, the Taliban, who were Deobandis. So Deobandi and Wahhabi coming together in action in Afghanistan in our own time, that we have seen. Anyways, coming back to Shah Waliullah. So Shah Waliullah was very alarmed, naturally, seeing the political power of Islam slide. And by the time he died, in fact, the entire political power of Muslims in India had almost wiped out. So the Hindu Swaraj, led by the Marathas, had occupied almost 3/4 territory of India. Despite Ahmad Shah Abdali's incursions, it in fact is beyond our topic to talk about the influence that had politically. But irrespective or despite that, Marathas only went from place to place of strength. And as there was a famous saying that from Attak to Cuttack, Attak in northwestern Punjab on the borders to Afghanistan northwest frontier, and in east to Cuttack in Odisha, Bengal border, Attak to Cuttack, there was saffron flag. In a letter written by Raghoba to the then Peshwa, written from Attak itself, he describes how Marathas have captured all the important forts in the northwest, how they have plans to expel whatever remaining seats of political military power the Mughals or Durranis have in the northwest, etc. Delhi itself, Mughals had become just a puppet of Marathas. Very powerful Jat kingdom had come up. It was still fledgling but very wealthy and powerful. In Nepal, under Prithvinarayan Shah, a very strong Gorkha empire come up in the Himalayan areas. In all of India, Kashmir was again freed up, and Sikhs had emerged just about at close of that century very powerful Sikh empire was coming up. Already Sikhs had become independent, but a full-fledged kingdom was just about to happen. And as a result, of course, Waliullah was shocked, and in his own lifetime, despite all the letters and pamphlets, not much was achieved. But he did pave the ideological platform on which the ideology, which later would become Deoband, was created. So his own son, Abdul Aziz, he continued the work of his father, and there were several disciples continuing this ideology of hardcore Sunniism that spread all over India. But it was not until his own disciple, Abdul Aziz's disciple, Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, his name is. So Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, and who is also known as Sayyid Ahmad Shaheed, and we shall soon come to why he is called Shaheed. But this Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, he is the true, I would say, ideological, in a practical way, ideological grandfather of this Deobandi ideology. So, as I said, end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century, Islam was in so much crisis in India, not only because of political situation, but even in the religious sphere. Hindus were showing quite a revival culturally, spiritually. There were, if you would scan the cultural, literary and spiritual sphere of the time, you can clearly see there were a lot of revival happening thanks to the political Swaraj that was apparently coming. So the result of that was again looking inward. So right from Shah Waliullah, Abdul Aziz and Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, their reaction was to become far more fundamentalist. The traditional Muslims in India, who were kind of becoming somewhat you could say loose in following the pristine way of Islam, etc. There were literary and cultural liberality to some extent, as you could see from Hyderabad or Lucknow's culture of that time. So all of that was very alarming. So Shah Waliullah's representative of the time, Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, he trained several very hardcore, almost like Wahhabi disciples in several cities of India. He himself, first of all, from his origins, was as multiple biographies say, was perhaps a soldier of booty who worked with a Pindari, quasi Pindari, Amir Khan, and so he was a plunderer, and he used to go with these mercenary army of Amir Khan, he and his brother. Eventually he would come back and kind of become a teacher, and spiritual religious awakening would happen, and he would become such a hardcore fundamentalist. Sometimes I have blogged about one story again which not many people have noticed, which is about Man Singh of Jodhpur. So the then Nath, head of the Nath Sampradaya, was murdered actually by conspiracies by this same pre-Deobandis, especially Amir Khan and Sayyid Ahmad and their followers. But that would digress us too far. So anyways, Tablighi Jamaat again remembers Sayyid Ahmad with lot of reverence. He is called a Shaheed. Shaheed because he had given a call of jihad against the Sikh Empire. And not only given a call of jihad, he in fact took a lot of Indian Muslims to Afghanistan. Himself, he was, as I said in the earlier part of his life, a soldier. So he was a commander as well, and he led armed jihad against Maharana Ranjit Singh. But long story short, the Sikhs made a small job of his jihad. He was quickly killed in the battle, interestingly in Balakot. So it's the same Balakot, town of Balakot, where Indian armed forces some time back had done the so-called surgical strike. So it's the same Balakot where this Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, also called Shaheed, he was killed. And then, of course, Europeans were the emerging power. British, not only in India but in almost entire Muslim world, had displaced them from power. So naturally, the Muslims, especially of this kind, were looking at the situation as a huge crisis of faith. And 1857 subsequently was, from their perspective, a jihad, which I alluded to earlier, that other historians such as Savarkar and many others have not paid so much attention to that angle, that they allied with the Hindu forces merely as a fellow traveler, but their goal was very clear. It was a jihad to re-establish Islamic power politically, so that Islam again can be furthered, interest of Islam can be furthered in religious life as well. So anyways, a few quick points at this juncture. First is about the name of Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi. People often confuse him to be related with the Barelvi sect of the Sunnis. So it's important to mention that he has hardly anything to do with the Barelvis. If anything, he could be said to be an exact opponent of the Barelvi ideology. Sayyid Ahmad is what would later become Deobandis and Tabligis. He has little to do with the Barelvis. And Barelvi Maulanas make it a point to mention that it's a misnomer to call Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, because he was not from the town of Bareilly but Rai Bareli, both being in Uttar Pradesh but quite a distance apart from each other. So that's the first point. Second is, it's perhaps noteworthy to mention that when Sayyid Ahmad traveled to Makkah, he was accompanied by more than 5 shipload of his followers. Many of these, along with Sayyid Ahmad, stayed in Arabia for quite a while, sometimes for more than a couple of years, and learnt there proper Wahhabi ideology, got influenced by the direct disciples of Abdul Wahhab. And when they returned to India, they properly radicalized the atmosphere, Sunni atmosphere, all over India, but especially in the North India. Couple of names perhaps worth mentioning include Maulana Shariatullah of Bengal, who was of course follower of Sayyid Ahmad, and upon his return he and his son preached quite a Wahhabi kind of a Sunni ideology in Bengal. You could call it a slightly diluted form of Wahhabism adjusted to India, but still pretty radical. Another Bengali actually worth mentioning is Titu Mir, who the Marxist historians often dress up as a great freedom fighter, just like Tipu Sultan, etc. But this Titu Mir person, he from his background was a Pahalwan, Lathet, strong man of local zamindars in Bengal, and then he took up a job with some minor Mughal and with that Mughal person, he went to Makkah. He was living there, already learning Wahhabism, and that is when he met in Arabia Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, got influenced by him, accepted him as his teacher, and when he returned to Bengal, he did a lot of very radical stuff, including an armed jihad. In that operation, he got killed by the British. In fact, in the same year, when the Sikhs in Balakot killed his master Sayyid Ahmad, at the same time he was killed by British in Bengal. Titu Mir's son, also just like Maulana Shariatullah's son, continued to carry forward his father's mission of radicalizing and Wahhabizing, you could say, the Sunnis of India, in this case of Bengal. So Titu Mir's footprint, just like that of his master Sayyid Ahmad, can be seen quite significantly in what would later become the hard lining of Muslims of India later on. But third point to mention here is, why does it concern the Tablighs beyond the ideological aspect? And it should not be missed that the founder of Tablighi Jamaat, Maulana Ilyas Kandalwi, actually is related directly with the names of people that I mentioned. So the biography of his, written by Ali Mia of Lucknow, he clearly traces the genealogy of Maulana Ilyas, and it seems the maternal grandfather of Maulana Ilyas, whose name was Maulana Muzaffar Hussain. Maulana Muzaffar Hussain was a direct disciple of a pretty important, in fact, principal disciple of the son of Waliullah. So his name was Muhammad Ishaq, and Muhammad Ishaq's disciple is the grandfather of Tablighi Jamaat's founder. Not only that, another ancestor of Maulana Ilyas Kandalwi, Mufti Ilahi Bakhsh, was a direct disciple of Abdul Aziz, and not only Abdul Aziz, after Abdul Aziz's death, he took Bayat, which is the ritual declaration of loyalty. He took Bayat with the Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi as well. So I just wanted to mention that even by genealogy and by this whole ancestry, the Tablighi Jamaat's founders are directly connected with all these personalities responsible for bringing the hardcore Wahhabi or near Wahhabi ideology to India, importing it from Arabia. And last thing, and a very important thing to mention here, is what Professor Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi interestingly mentions. So in this book that I keep referring to, Shah Waliullah and His Times, he at one place very clearly mentions that efforts were afoot in his own time, in times of Professor Rizvi, by other academicians to kind of whitewash and in a way hide some of these non-palatable ideological moorings of the personalities like Shah Waliullah. So I wanted to quote one part of what he writes. In fact, he mentions this thing not only in this book, Shah Waliullah and His Times, but in another work which can be called sequel of the same book, which is about his son Abdul Aziz. So in both he mentions something similar. So I quote from Shah Waliullah and His Times. He says, in the text, Nizami puts an asterisk and in the footnotes writes Kalima-e Hashtum, followed by a few dots, and does not say anything further. The present author, here Rizvi is referring to himself, has always been puzzled by this omission. But the collation of Nizami's text with the microfilm of the Rampur manuscript suggests that the Kalima-i-Hashtum might have been available in Nizami's manuscript, but was deliberately omitted in order to make the letter compatible with cosmopolitan and modernist image of Shah Waliullah. And Professor Rizvi goes on to quote verbatim the Persian part of that Kalima-i-Hashtum, which translates as, "Strict order should be issued in all Islamic towns forbidding religious ceremonies publicly practiced by infidels, such as the performance of holy and ritual bathing in the Ganga. On the 10th of Muharram, Shias should not be allowed to go beyond the bounds of moderation, neither should they be rude nor repeat stupid things in the streets or bazaars." There are significant gaps in the text of other letters published by Nizami, and comparison of these letters with the Rampur copy indicates annoying omissions, thus undermining the utility of this edition. So it's very important to mention, although not directly connected with the topic at hand, but in the passing, maybe some other time we can talk more about it, that here is a professor, Rizvi, of Aligarh Muslim University itself, principal student of another great scholar of Aligarh Muslim University, Professor Muhammad Habib, writing in 1950s, early 1960s, openly saying how the very clear suppression, omission of even the direct source material was going on, and he suspects going on to present an image of these events and personalities which suited the narrative of a more modernist, secularist image of this Islamization project, which we can see later on had only become amplified as the time passed. Zakir Hussain and of course the Human Development Minister Abdul Kalam Azad were at the helm of affairs. And it may not be out of the place to mention that Zakir Hussain himself, leading light of Jamia Millia Islamia, was a career Tablighi all his life. This Professor K.A. Nizami, by the way, went on to have a great career not only at the Aligarh Muslim University, so much so that there is a school within AMU that is named after Professor Nizami, but also he was picked up by the Congress party to lead the diplomatic mission of Indian government in Syria. So he retired as a career diplomat after having spent I think 3 decades or more in Aligarh Muslim University as a historian. But anyway, let's stray too far, and we should just be thankful to honest, upright historians like Professor Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi, who shed light, discovered, edited and published original sources in Farsi, Arabic and Turkic for common public such as ourselves.